the native, them don't steal the show. As they started telling more, it have a club all night, everything turn white, like powder is the goal. So if you know you can't take it, me beg you better don't fake it. Cause in this true field when we come out.
Where are the Africans, the so-called African slaves? This is a history of the island of Caire under the Spanish government by Pierre Gustave Louis Bor. Publication date is 1883. All right. So again, we're just looking at the dates. We're looking to see where, if at any point in time, they brought any so-called quote-unquote African slaves here. All right. So let's look at the dates. We're just going straight to page 8 of this book. Oh, let me just go back to the cover so you can see the book. Right. Just had a bit to be translated. All right. So, history of the Caire. Oh. Under the Spanish government, there is the second edition by M. Pierre Fiave Lokia board. All right. Let's look at some dates in here. We're starting from here. But for the advancement of the colonization of these conquests, administrative measures and something could only be ineffective. I repute, but some of the words missing from the translation, so we just had to make sense of what we're reading. Of these territories by foreigners, since the Spaniards could not suffice to this task, was the only means to be employed, but it was unacceptable. Since the death of Isabella the Catholic, the theory of the foundation, so this after the death of Isabella here now, right? We into see the dates coming up. So the theory of the since the death of Elizabeth the Catholic, the theory of the foundation of colonies in view of Tavan, the exclusive nature of the metropolises had prevailed in councils of Spain, and foreigners had been severely punished, excluded from its transatlantic establishments. So what they was calling the transatlantic establishments or the transatlantic movement, you would see what year and you would see where they was moving to, right? As a result of the donation of Pope Alexander VI, the whole of the New World had been considered only as a property of the crown, to which no one had the right to touch, and which could not be used or utilized only for its particular use. Any trade other than that of the Spanish productions was strictly prohibited. The Spanish alone was reserved for the faculty of trafficking there. The exclusion of foreigners was rigorous, to such an extent that the crews of their nations alleges, no, not that. Pledges that were wrecked on the coast were kept for pirates and treated as such. The population in which the colonies maintained themselves and their to a vast system of smuggling were the consequence of this exclusive regime. Illicit trade, growing as that the manufacturers of the metropolis were exhausted, had attracted many traders to the New World and foreign adventures, right? We have already seen that since for a long time, the French and the English and the Dutch, armed as corsairs, remember that, roamed the coast of the continent, South America. So they're talking about the transatlantic establishments in South America, not transatlantic between Africa and the Americas. They're talking about between Spain and the Spanish Canary Islands to South America, the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Paria, and the banks of Torrenocos to intercept the commerce of the Spanish, probably, right? Some words missing. We shall now see them emboldened by success and by numbers to undertake to found permanent establishments in the islands and on the coast of French Guiana. The establishments had become indispensable as warehouse for the foreign products, and as ports of supply and rallying points in the incessant wars over the Spanish Navy. Little concern, moreover, with the papal liberalities, the papal bulls. Foreigners were anxious to take advantage of the weakness into which Spain had fallen, for to dispute with him the territories and trade of the Newfoundland, I think, or new whatever, and also to collect their share of its riches. Or riches is they have here. But that's how they used to write, and this is just the interpretation by Google here. Right? It was first in the territories not occupied by the Spaniards that they settled. That is the French, the Corsairs, right? Which is a band of the French, the English, and the Dutch together. It was in the territories not occupied by the Spanish that they settled in 1625. So again, when were they bringing quote unquote African slaves over to the Caribbean? If in 1625 they were now undertaking trying to settle where the Spaniards were and operating in between their transatlantic establishments, according to them here on the page that we read before. In 1625, during 30 years of war, the French and the English, by a strange coincidence, landed on the same day on two opposite points on the coast of the small island of St. Christophe, now St. Kitts, right? So that's in 1625, two of them land on the island on the same day. They wasn't bringing no slaves here. They was still exploring in the 1600s, right? The first pennies, something missing. The conduct of a gentleman named the Inambuk, and the second under the command of Sir Thomas Warner. The island, like the rest of the Lesser Antilles, except Kairi, was still inhabited only by, I think it's Arawak Caribbean or something like that they're supposed to have here. Instead of quarreling and disputing over it, the two land on the same day, the French and the English. Its possession, the two commanders agreed with his to share it amicably and remain united, even if the metropolises were to make war on each other in Europe. So there was warring against the Spanish Inquisition was going on in Europe, and these brothers and them was coming out here. That's the ones who fled, right? The dirty Moors, them, the swarthy ones, them, right? They fled over here and they made their alliance over here, even if the how we call it, the overlords was warring in Europe. So we continue this. This agreement signed, each one established himself his side, and sometimes together, sometimes separately, put at war against the natives. So they used to take wrongs at going at the natives, basically, tag team type of stuff, right? Whose depredation, nocturnal shuns brought trouble to both stages of establishments. I think of was missing there, right? The Indians, once subdued or driven out in the neighboring fires, the French commander of Inambuk undertook to establish new colonies in the Antilles. He charged one of his lieutenants, Desir of Olive, to visit the lands still in power of their natural estates and to negotiate the secession of them to the crown, probably, and on the favorable report he received, made Guadeloupe and Martinique in the 1990s. So that they run since the 1600s, and Guadeloupe and them, because of that favorable report that he received, they end up still under French rule in the 1990s, right? After the establishment in St. Christophe, the Antilles, something probably, also began to found new colonies in the West Indies. Independently of Barbados, that King James I believes he has the right to yield to the Count of Halborough as early as 1625, under the pretext that she has discovered by its sailors, or some probably, I don't know what the end of they occupied in 1628 the two small islands of Las Neves, named today or something, broken into Nevio and Barbuda, probably Nevis and Barbuda, right? The following year, in 1629, they also 1629 now, they settled on the island of La Nouvelle province, one of the Lucayas, And 3 years later, in 1632, in those of Antigua and Montserrat, when were they bringing African, quote unquote, African slaves, right? These various islands were like St. Christopher, habited by Caribs, according to them, Galibi. They call them Caribs, right? In 1625, they were inhabited by them, which they had to dislodge in order to take possession. So they now reach the 1600s, right? In the early 1600s, right? They now reach the Caribbean in the early 1600s. So when were they bringing quote unquote African slaves here? While the French and English were taking possession in the West Indies, the Dutch of their side, after having established themselves in Guyana on the banks of the Essequibo, Berbice and the Merari, and even in Brazil, had deemed it necessary for the care of their business interlope to possess also an island in the archipelago, right? So they wanted the island, although there was outside the South American plate, they also wanted the island in the archipelago, the China Islands, right? They also needed to do the same than to the other two nations, from the maritime stations to the Antilles. To this end, in 1632, they occupied the islands of Alubera, misnomer Tobago, and nearest to Cairi, whose nation or whose natives had not yet been disturbed. You're hearing this, people? All up to 1632, all up to the 1600s, right? 400 years ago, the island natives on these islands, Alubera and Cairi, were not disturbed all in the early 1600s. When did they bring quote unquote African slaves to here? It was a company of merchants from Vlissingen who came there, established. She founded 200 Zealanders. Remember, we read in an earlier paragraph, earlier book, that Alubera was the first free settled state on the planet, right? The first free man state. A colony, not that it's something good, it's just that these colonizers was the first free settled state where all colonizers could have come and settle and have free operation and that type of thing, right? A colony to which gave the name of Nuevo Welcheren. Thus attacked by all foreigners at once, the Spaniards, though fallen from their former power, did not allow themselves to be torn away with impunity to be found. Outraged spectators of the looting of property, they believed themselves to be legitimate owners, and they fiercely pulled those who stripped them of it. Scarcely had they established themselves on one point when the colony had to rely on the demands of armies of titular owners, right? Titular powers like the Queen and that type of thing. Isabella, or whoever succeeded Isabella in Spain. This is how, from 1630, we see a fleet arrive in San Domingue, right? Or Santo Domingo. 15 frigates under the command of Admiral Frederick of Toledo, and 24 transports for all right, let me see, 24 transports for exterminate the pirates. That is just how they have it in their interpretation or the translation, sorry, or how the French also translating from Spanish, right? So, oh no, French, right? So that's how we're picking it up here in the translation. Anyhow, to exterminate the pirates, the name by which Spain despised in order to brand them his opponents of the New World. So anybody who had opposed Spain were called pirates, right? Whose establishments were not yet openly accepted by their metropolises. Against an armament as formidable as the French and English of St. Christophe could not oppose any resistance, effective stance or resistance, they were defeated after having deployed heroic courage. All those who did not fall into the hands of the Spaniards were forced to flee off the island. Then came the turn of the Dutch from Guyana and Brazil, which were also dislodged without this difficulty. But the storm passed. The obstinate foreigners whose number increased day by day as a result of the extension of their illicit trade, came to raise their ruined establishment and to take possession of territories that Spain, increasingly weakened, was less and less able to, probably what missing here is, defend, right? In the absence of the exhausted metropolis, the colonies, something missing here, foreign establishments undertook by also to destroy these strangers. They could not, without umbrage, see these hearts rise around them, smuggling. The occupation of the island of Alubera by the Dutch, shortly after their discomfiture at Guyana and Brazil, was one of the usurpations which the government of New Andalusia, Captain General Don Diego Lopez de Escobar, resolved to drive them out. This island, being separated from Cairi only by a narrow canal, easily and quickly traversable by canoe, it conceived the project of going there to surprise the invaders before they had time to increase their numbers and to erect fortifications. To this end, he occupied himself, procure a sufficient number of boats, and to have Indian spies watch the march of the works of defense of the Dutch colony. After having made these arrangements, he left Cumana, the head of the troops at his disposal, and went to Cairi. LK, whatever that means, he joined a company of Indians. Likewise, probably, he joined a company of Indians, seasoned, assembled his flotilla in the little bay of Toko opposite Alubera, and waited for the favorable moment to fall on the enemy. This moment did not take place, wait a long time. On a calm night and professional day, Pice, he takes his world on board, crosses in a few hours the arm of the sea which separates the two islands, and falls to the unexpectedly on the invaders. That's just how to read it, as you could see. The unfortunate Zealanders, surprised in sleep, are all slaughtered or taken prisoner. Their plantations are devastated, and still unfinished walls of their fortress and their arms and provisions transported to the Cairi. Like St. Christophe, French Guiana and Brazil, the island of Alubera could not be occupied by the Spaniards, who had already too few in establishments they had trained. Like a dog in the fable, the ambition of these men confined themselves to wanting to chase the other nations of territories from which it was impossible for them to derive any use, since those in which they had settled, they had established themselves, succumbed as a result of depopulation. Even back then, they was going through that, right? The settlers. The New Andalusia, in particular, was a larger territory. That of the whole peninsula was still deserted. Something could claim to add new conquests. Something like that. I don't know what these mean. Its principal province, that of Cumana, was not yet inhabited by the Espaguids. Pi, in its unique city of Nueva Cordova or New Cordoba, New Gumana, and its surroundings. The second city of this vast country, San Felipe de Austria, or Saint Philip of Austria, today something called Riaco, had been destroyed by the Caribs in 1630, right? The Caribs destroyed that and had remained in ruins. All the rest of the country was still in the hands of his natives, the Indians, Cumanagotos and Palenques. Like that of Cumana, the province of Guyana possessed only the city of San Tome, transported by Don Antonio de Berrio y Oruna from the mouth of the Caroni to the summit of the Orinoco Delta, at something to the east of its first side. The Spaniards did not occupy it than the city and its surroundings within a radius of than a mile, of that greater than a mile, probably. This immense country of natural meadows, still in possession of the natives, does not pre something, still felt for parts that his majestic rivers. As for Cairi, its union with Cumana, that is, Cumana is on Venezuela, right? 7 miles south from Cairi, right? So because of that union during the period which forms the object of this chapter, had hardly advanced its colonization. You overstand, all in the 1600s, going up to the late 16s now, into the 17s, right? In the increasing something of the Spanish population, increasing, depopulation probably of the Spanish population, in the submission of its natural states and in the development of its culture. No progress had been made. She had stayed stationary, and as at the death of Don Fernando de Berrio, his most important establishment consisted of a small number of conucos gathered around San Jose of Orilla, yeah. Puerto de los Españoles was still Canan, all right, village of some fishermen Cabanese. The island was still covered with inhabited virgin forests by the rebellious Indian tribes. Right? So again, when were they bringing them? You see the dates here. We just stop here for now to be giving in parts. So see you in the next installment.